His forearm hit her throat before anyone in that emergency room could breathe. Officer Brett Harlan had her pinned against the wall in front of 40 witnesses, his face 2 inches from hers, veins rising in his neck, his voice dropping to something quiet and ugly. "You think I won't end you right here?" And Lee Calloway, who had pulled wounded soldiers out of burning vehicles in 3 combat zones, who had kept her hands steady under fire that would have broken most men, just looked at him. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She waited. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the very end, because what walks through those doors next will leave you absolutely speechless. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story like this, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The shift started the way every Tuesday morning started at Riverside General Hospital in Milford, Ohio. Lee Calloway arrived at 6:40, 15 minutes before her shift technically began, the same way she had arrived every single morning for the past 3 years, without exception. She parked her 12-year-old Civic in the far corner of the staff lot, clipped her badge before she even reached the ambulance bay, and pushed through the doors without breaking stride. The overnight crew was in the final hour of their rotation. She could tell by the way they moved, that particular boneless exhaustion of people running on nothing but obligation and cold coffee, counting minutes rather than patience. Dex Porter was at the charge desk when she came in, 6'2", mid-40s, with the kind of permanently tired shoulders you earn from 16 years of emergency nursing, and the kind of eyes that still managed to be kind despite everything those eyes had seen. He looked up from his handoff clipboard and gave her the nod that passed for a greeting between people who had worked beside each other long enough that actual words felt redundant most of the time. "Board's clean, but it won't stay that way," he said. "Lobby's already got 7 waiting, and it's not even 7 o'clock. "It never stays clean," Lee said. She took the clipboard, poured herself a cup of black coffee from the nurse's station, and ran the board in 20 seconds. 7 in the lobby, 2 in observation, 1 pediatric flagged urgent. She absorbed the information the way she absorbed everything, quickly, completely, already forming a plan before she finished reading. She had been doing that for as long as she could remember, processing environments fast, identifying what mattered, moving toward it. Dex watched her the way he always watched her during handoff. 3 years working beside this woman, and he still couldn't entirely read her. She was good, genuinely, remarkably good in ways that went beyond training. The kind of nurse that residents quietly fought to have in the room when a case got complicated. But she kept a distance that wasn't unfriendly. It was contained, like someone who had learned a long time ago that the lid needed to stay on tight and had gotten so good at keeping it there that they'd stopped noticing the pressure underneath. He had learned not to ask about it. In an emergency room, everyone came with a history. The ones who lasted had figured out how to carry theirs without setting it on the floor where somebody could trip. By 8:30, the lobby was full, and the board had gone from manageable to demanding. Milford was a mid-sized city that had been quietly struggling for a decade. The kind of place where the manufacturing economy had walked out the door 10 years ago and hadn't sent word about when it was coming back. Riverside General absorbed everything that came with that. The stress, the accidents, the chronic conditions left untreated too long because people had to choose between the copay and the grocery bill. On a Tuesday morning, the ER processed a man with a hand laceration from a table saw, a teenager with a possible concussion, 2 elderly patients with cardiac complaints, and a 5-year-old girl named Emma Briggs, whose mother had carried her through the doors at 7:50 because Emma had developed a cough 2 days ago that had turned into something harder and faster in a way that her mother, Sarah Briggs, described with the specific, frightened precision of a parent who knows something is wrong but doesn't have the medical words for it. Lee had triaged Emma at 8:42. She spent 5 minutes with the child, 2 minutes longer than protocol required. When she came out, she went directly to the attending on duty, Dr. Marcus Reyes, a 38-year-old who ran on 2 cups of coffee in the genuine belief that emergency medicine was what he was put on earth to do. Emma Briggs in Bay 4, Lee said. She needs imaging and a respiratory consult before anything else. Reyes looked at the board. She's not flagged critical. She will be. Lee said it without drama. She's compensating right now. She won't be in another hour. The way she's using her accessory muscles to breathe, that's not a kid with a bad cold, Marcus. That's a kid working. Reyes had been working beside Lee long enough to understand something important about her. She did not speculate. She did not overreact. When she said something with that particular flat certainty, the correct response was to listen. He looked at the board one more time, then back at her. Bay 4, he said. Get her set up. I'll be right there. That decision, made in a quiet hallway at 8:44 in the morning, was the decision that would matter more than any other by the end of the day. But nobody in that ER knew that yet. Emma was moved to Bay 4. Imaging was ordered. A respiratory therapist was paged. Sarah Briggs sat in the chair beside her daughter's bed and held Emma's hand with the kind of grip that communicated everything that couldn't be said out loud in front of a 5-year-old. She looked at Lee with the universal expression of a parent in a room they never wanted to be in. Is she going to be okay? We're figuring out exactly what's happening right now, Lee said. That's the most important step, and we're already doing it. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was true. And something in Sarah's face registered the difference, and she nodded, and she held her daughter's hand a little tighter. The morning built the way Tuesday mornings in a county ER always built, steadily, then all at once. By 10 o'clock, the board had 14 patients, and Lee was coordinating a construction accident, 2 walk-ins, and a possible spinal injury that had consumed the trauma bay and most of Dr. Reyes's attention. She moved through it the way she always moved through it. No wasted motion, no raised voice, just the quiet, efficient management of chaos by someone who had managed chaos before. Real chaos, the kind that didn't come with overhead lighting and clean floors, and the certainty that help was coming. It was 11:20 when the police cruiser pulled up to the ambulance bay. 2 officers came through the doors. The first one, young, maybe 26, with the posture of someone who had been on the job long enough to know the uniform, but not long enough to stop performing it, was helping a 3rd man in street clothes. Gunshot wound to the left thigh, makeshift tourniquet above the knee, conscious and alert. The young officer's name, she'd learn later, was Elkins. He was doing everything correctly. He stayed close to his prisoner, kept his voice low, made eye contact with the triage desk like a person asking for help. The second officer was something different entirely. His name was Brett Harlan, 39 years old, built wide, with a jaw that looked like it had been installed specifically to communicate authority. His uniform was pressed sharp. His badge caught the fluorescent light when he moved. He walked into that emergency room the way certain men walk into every room they enter, with the absolute assumption that the space would reorganize itself around him, that whatever hierarchy existed in any room, he occupied the top of it. He went straight to the triage desk where Lee was standing. GSW, left thigh, prisoner transport, he said. No greeting, no please. The tone of a man placing an order. He goes straight back. Now. Lee looked past him to the man being supported near the door. She assessed him in 3 seconds. Wound location, tourniquet placement, skin color, level of consciousness, rate of breathing, and turned back to Harlan. We'll get him registered, and a nurse will assess him for... I didn't say assess. Harlan put his hand flat on the desk. Not a fist, but not nothing either. I said straight back. This is an active custody situation. He goes first. I understand the situation, Lee said, and we will take care of him. But we have a protocol for... Your protocol doesn't apply when I tell you it doesn't apply. The desk between them was maybe 3 feet wide. Harlan was leaning across it. His voice had the particular controlled aggression of a man who had learned that lowering his volume made people more afraid than raising it. Several people in the waiting area looked up. Priya Shankar, the nurse at the neighboring station, found something urgent to study on her computer screen. "You're going to move him to the front right now," Harlan said, "or I'm going to have a very serious conversation with whoever runs this place." Down the hall, in Bay 4, Lee heard it. Emma Briggs made a sound, the specific, slightly labored exhale of a child whose airway was working harder than it should. Not a cry, just a breath that cost more than it should have cost. The respiratory therapist was in there. Reyes had been paged, but Lee had been planning to check on that child the moment she had someone to cover the desk. She turned back to Harlan. "We have a 5-year-old in Bay 4 in respiratory distress," she said. "She is my first priority right now. Your prisoner has a thigh wound with a tourniquet in place. He's stable. I will get someone to him in—" "Did I stutter?" Harlan's voice dropped. It didn't get louder. It went the other direction, quieter, and somehow more dangerous for it. The waiting room had gone almost completely silent. The murmur of the television in the corner continued. A baby somewhere made a sound. But the 40-odd people in that lobby had stopped looking at their phones and were looking at the triage desk. "I don't care about some kid," Harlan said. "I have a custody situation and a departmental liability, and you are going to move him first." The words "some kid" landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Priya's hands went still on her keyboard. The orderly pushing a supply cart at the far end of the hallway slowed to a stop. The young officer, Elkins, shifted his weight near the door with the expression of a man who was starting to wish he'd called in sick. Lee's face did not change, not a flicker. "Sir," she said, and her voice was so measured it almost sounded gentle. "I need you to step back from the desk." Harlan stared at her. Then he did something she hadn't quite expected. He laughed. Not a real laugh, the other kind. The kind that communicates contempt so efficiently it doesn't need words. "Step back," he repeated, like she'd said something absurd. He looked her over the way people look at something they've decided isn't worth their full attention. "You're a nurse. You don't tell me to step back. You do what I tell you to do. And right now I'm telling you to move that prisoner to the front of the line." "I can't do that." 4 words. No heat in them. No apology. Just the quiet, immovable fact of them. Harlan went very still. The kind of stillness that precedes something. "You want to say that again?" he said. "Your prisoner is not in critical condition," Lee said. "The child in Bay 4 may be. That determines priority in this department. Not the badge, not the volume, the medical need. That's not a policy I can override. That's medicine." For a long moment, nothing happened. The monitors beeped from the far bays. The television murmured. And Todd Brett Harlan stood at the triage desk of Riverside General Hospital with his hand pressed flat against the surface and the specific expression of a man who has told someone they are small and been disagreed with, and has not yet decided what to do about that. "Get your supervisor," he said, "right now." Lee didn't move immediately. She turned to Priya. "Can you page Dr. Reyes and let him know I need 2 minutes?" Then she came around the desk and walked toward the consultation alcove near the triage entrance, the standard location for conversations that shouldn't happen in front of patients. "We can talk over here," she said to Harlan. He followed her. Elkins stayed near the door with his prisoner, helping him into a chair with the careful attentiveness of someone doing his actual job correctly. In the alcove, Harlan dropped the professional register entirely. "I don't know who trained you," he said, stepping close. Close enough that most people would have taken a step back. "Or who told you that you could talk to a law enforcement officer that way. But let me be very clear. I have been in this hospital a lot of times. I know how this place works. And a nurse, especially a nurse who looks like she just finished orientation, does not override a police officer in a custody transport situation. Do you understand me?" Lee did not step back. "Looks can be misleading," she said. "Not a threat, not a boast, just a statement of observable fact. Something shifted in Harlan's expression, a recalibration, like he'd said something he thought was simple and gotten an answer he didn't fully understand. "Is that so?" he said. "The triage order isn't going to change," she said. He leaned in. His voice went somewhere ugly, somewhere that had nothing professional left in it. "You are going to regret this. I promise you that." Lee looked at him with those steady, unhurried eyes. "Okay," she said simply, and she turned and walked back out to the floor. She was at the medication cart when Gerald Walsh arrived. The hospital administrator on duty was a 53-year-old man with salt and pepper hair and the particular brand of institutional anxiety that came from spending 2 decades managing situations that no policy manual quite anticipated. He crossed the ER floor wearing his lanyard and his concern in equal measure, and Lee watched him arrive from across the room while simultaneously tracking the sound coming from Bay 4. Emma's breathing had a new quality to it, slightly faster than it had been 20 minutes ago. Walsh reached her at the nurse's station. "Lee," he said, with the careful tone of a man walking across uncertain terrain, "Officer Harlan has raised some concerns about the triage process this morning." "I know," she said. "He feels that there was some hostility in the way the situation was handled." "I was not hostile." She said it without inflection. "The prisoner was stable. The pediatric patient was not. Triage protocol exists for exactly that reason. I followed it." Walsh glanced at Harlan, who had positioned himself 10 feet away with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man waiting for a verdict he'd already decided was coming his way. "I understand that," Walsh said carefully, "and I'm not saying you were wrong, but Officer Harlan has a long relationship with this department, and given the hospital's relationship with the precinct—" "She refused a direct order," Harlan said from across the floor, apparently done with the pretense of distance. "It wasn't an order," Lee said, still speaking to Walsh. "He doesn't give orders in a medical facility. The only authority in this department over clinical decisions belongs to the attending physician." "You want to watch your mouth?" Harlan stepped forward. Walsh raised a hand. "Let's just—" "No." Harlan wasn't looking at Walsh anymore. He was looking at Lee with something that had crossed past professional frustration into something more personal. The specific, reflexive anger of someone who had told a person they didn't matter and had been disagreed with at full volume in front of witnesses. "I am done being patient here. Either she leaves this floor voluntarily or I'm filing a formal obstruction complaint, and you can explain that to your board of directors." Walsh looked at Lee. The apology was in his eyes before he said a word. The helplessness, the calculation, the desperate hope that she might just make this easier for everyone. Lee looked back at him. "Gerald," she said. Her voice was quiet, absolutely quiet, the kind of quiet that had nothing to do with uncertainty. "A child in Bay 4 is alive and receiving the correct treatment because of what I did this morning. I'm not leaving this floor." Harlan made a sound. Then he moved. Nobody expected it, which was why nobody stopped it. He grabbed her arm first, spinning her toward the wall, and then his forearm was across her throat, and her back was against the surface beside the medication room door, and the entire emergency room seemed to inhale at once and hold it. Every person in that space suddenly and completely still. Because what was happening in front of them was something that did not happen, that could not be happening, that was happening anyway. "You think this is a game?" His face was 6 inches from hers, his forearm pressed harder. "You think you get to disrespect me in a public hospital, in front of my department?" Lee's hands came up, not fighting, not striking, the practiced positioning of someone managing an airway compression, someone who understood precisely what was happening to their body and was responding with training instead of panic. Her feet were barely touching the floor. Her eyes were open, completely steady. The way eyes are steady when the person behind them has been in situations where panic was not an option, and has burned that response out of themselves at the cellular level. "You're making," she said, and each word came out measured, working around the pressure on her throat, "a significant mistake." Big talk from someone who can't breathe. "Todd." Elkins's voice from near the door was thin and strained, but it was there. "Todd, come on, you need to back off right now." 3 nurses moved simultaneously, shouting. Dr. Reyes came out of Bay 2 at a dead run. Walsh was saying something that wasn't reaching anyone. The young officer, Elkins, looked like a man who had watched a car go off a bridge and could not decide whether to jump in after it or call for help. Harlan pressed harder. "You're going to apologize," he said, "and then you're going to pack up your things and go home, and we're going to say this was a misunderstanding. That's how this ends." And then the doors opened. Not the main entrance, the ambulance bay. The heavy automatic doors that only open when something significant was coming through. The sound entered the room before anything visible did. Low and mechanical. Multiple vehicle engines, close and coordinated. The kind of sound that meant something organized had arrived. Everyone in that emergency room heard it. Even Harlan heard it. His arm didn't drop, not yet, but something in his face shifted. A flicker of something he wasn't expecting. Then they came through. 4 of them first, in uniform, moving with the compact purposefulness of people trained to enter unfamiliar spaces and understand them immediately. They spread slightly, instinctively, not in a threatening way, but in the way of people who have made a habit of knowing where everyone in a room is standing. Then 2 more behind them. And then, in the center of the formation, not hurrying, not performing urgency, walking with the particular gravity of someone who has never once needed to announce himself, because every room he entered already understood. A man in his late 50s, lean and exact, close-cropped silver hair, 4 silver stars on his collar. He walked through the doors of Riverside General Hospital Emergency Department the way a man walks when he has walked into places considerably more dangerous than this and has not once broken stride. He took in everything in a single sweep. The nurses frozen in position, the patients staring. Gerald Walsh standing with his mouth open and his lanyard hanging. The security guards who had finally arrived and were hovering with the paralysis of men who understood that every choice they made had consequences they couldn't fully calculate. And then his eyes found the wall beside the medication room, and the woman pinned against it. And everything about him went completely, utterly still. The room felt it. Every person in that lobby felt it, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm arrives. Even Brett Harlan felt it. His forearm dropped by reflex before his brain had finished processing why. The man crossed the floor in 7 steps. When he stopped, the space around him reorganized. Not dramatically, not with theatrics. The way a room reorganizes itself around its actual gravitational center. He looked at Lee. He looked at the redness already rising at her throat, the careful way she was holding herself, the steadiness of her breathing. Then he said, in a voice that was not loud, that was in fact almost quiet, but that somehow occupied every cubic inch of that emergency room, "Petty Officer Calloway." The words landed like something structural, load-bearing, like something clicked into place that the room didn't know was missing. Lee straightened. Her chin came up. Her hands dropped to her sides. "Admiral," she said. The word moved through the room like a current. Priya's hand went to her mouth. Reyes stopped moving. Walsh made a sound that was not a word. And Brett Harlan, Officer Brett Harlan, who had pinned a woman against a wall by her throat in front of 40 witnesses in a functioning emergency department, stood very still with the specific stillness of a man who has just thrown a punch and is only now registering the size of what he has hit. "Are you injured?" the Admiral said. "I'm functional, sir." He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that was not warmth exactly, more like recognition. the compressed shorthand of two people who have operated together in conditions that no one else in this room had any reference point for. Then he turned. He turned toward Brett Harlan with the slow, unhurried movement of someone who has all the time in the world because the outcome of the next several minutes is not a question he needs to resolve. It is simply a thing that is going to happen. Harlan met his eyes. His training kicked in before his judgment could stop it. His spine straightened. His chin came up slightly. The ingrained muscle memory of a man who had served, who knew what 4 stars meant, who understood at some animal level that the correct response to this specific person in this specific moment was a posture that communicated respect. "Sir, No." The Admiral said just that one word, and Harlan went silent. The Admiral looked at him the way a man looks at a problem he is about to solve. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This woman," he said, and each word arrived with the precision of something placed rather than thrown, completed 8 years of service with Naval Special Operations Medical Support Units. She performed under fire across 4 combat deployments. She has been decorated for actions that I am not at liberty to discuss in detail in this room. The monitors beeped from the far bays. Somewhere a machine registered a heartbeat. The television in the corner murmured something nobody was listening to. "And you put your forearm across her throat," the Admiral said, "in a public hospital, in front of witnesses, while she was performing medical triage." Brett Harlan's color had drained to something that was not quite white, not quite gray, the specific pallor of a man whose certainty has collapsed so completely and so suddenly that his body hasn't finished catching up to what his mind is beginning to understand. He was not smart enough yet for the full weight of it, not yet, but the beginning of it was there. The first cold recognition of a man who has spent years inside a system that bent the rules for him, who has never once stood in a room where the rules didn't bend, who is standing in one now. "Take him," the Admiral said. The 2 personnel on his left moved. Harlan said, "Wait," but his voice had lost its architecture. The certainty was gone. All the practiced authority, all the years of assuming that walking into a room meant owning it, gone. What was left was just a man who had spent a long time in a role that told him the rules bent around him, standing in the one room on this particular Tuesday morning where they did not. The handcuffs came out, and every person in that emergency room, the nurses, the doctors, the patients in the waiting area, the young officer named Elkins, who would later file a complete voluntary statement without being asked, watched as the man who had said, "You're just a nurse," was walked toward the exit in restraints. Lee Calloway stood in the middle of Riverside General Hospital's emergency department and let out one slow, controlled breath. Then she picked up the chart she had set down and walked back toward Bay 4. Emma Briggs was still in there, 5 years old, with a rabbit tucked under her arm and a respiratory system that had been working too hard for too long. The imaging results were waiting. The respiratory therapist was waiting. And a child who had come through those doors that morning because her mother knew something was wrong was still waiting for someone to tell her it was going to be okay. Lee pushed through the bay curtain. She looked at the chart. She looked at the child. She got to work. The imaging results came back at 11:53. Lee was standing at the foot of Emma's bed when Reyes walked in holding the tablet, and she read his face before she read the screen. She had learned, over years of working beside physicians in conditions far worse than this, that a doctor's expression in the first half second after reviewing results told you more than the results themselves. Reyes's expression said, "I was afraid of this." "Pneumonia," he said quietly, turning the tablet so she could see. "Early pleural effusion on the right side. Fluid starting to accumulate around the lung." He looked at Emma, who was lying against her pillow with her stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest and her eyes half open. That particular drowsy quality of a child whose body has been working too hard for too long. "Good catch, Calloway." Another 2 hours, and we'd have been looking at a very different conversation. Sarah Briggs was gripping the bed rail with both hands. "What does that mean? Is she—" "We caught it," Lee said. Steady, direct. Not the false brightness that sometimes made frightened parents feel worse, but the plain, grounded weight of someone telling the truth. Dr. Reyes knows exactly what he's treating. Emma's going to get the right medication today, and she's going to go home in a few days, breathing like herself again. Sarah looked at her daughter. Her jaw worked. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," Lee said. She meant it. That was the thing about those 2 words. They only worked when they were true, and she would not have said them if they weren't. She left Reyes explaining the treatment plan, stepped out of the bay, and walked back into an emergency room that looked like the aftermath of something seismic. The physical space was unchanged. Same floor, same lights, same smell of antiseptic and burned coffee. But the atmosphere had shifted in the way atmospheres shift after extraordinary events. People were still processing where to put what they'd witnessed. Nurses spoke in low clusters. An orderly moved a supply cart with exaggerated focus, the universal body language of someone who desperately wants to appear uninvolved. Gerald Walsh was on the phone near the administrator's alcove, one hand pressed to his forehead, nodding with the frequency of a man receiving information he'd have preferred not to receive. 0 hours, 12 minutes, 0 seconds. And standing near the ambulance bay doors, precisely where the confrontation had happened, was Admiral James Caldwell. He hadn't left. Lee had half expected him to be gone. He was not a man who lingered. In the 8 years she had known him, first as a junior corpsman, then in operational contexts she didn't discuss with anyone, she had never once seen him remain in a location after his purpose was complete. He moved through the world with the calculated efficiency of a man for whom time was the one resource you couldn't requisition more of. But he was still here. And when she came around the corner, he waited. She crossed the floor. She felt people watching her do it, not with hostility, but with the urgent need to revise their understanding of the woman who had been standing at that triage desk 3 hours ago. The woman they had seen every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 years, who poured black coffee and pulled the charged clipboard and moved through difficult situations with a quietness that they had all, in their different ways, mistaken for ordinary. "Walk with me," Caldwell said when she reached him. They went to the small family consultation room at the end of the East Corridor, the one with the beige chairs and the tissue box that was always somehow half empty. He closed the door. Neither of them sat. "Your throat," he said. "It's fine." He looked at her the way he had always looked at her when she said that. Not disbelief exactly, more the careful skepticism of a man who had learned that her definition of fine covered a range of conditions most people would describe with considerably more alarm. "I need you to be seen by someone," he said. "I'm in a hospital." "I'm aware of where we are, Calloway." "Then you know I can assess my own airway." She held his gaze. "Minimal bruising, no significant hoarseness. I've had worse." The last 3 words settled between them and stayed there. Both of them knew precisely what she was referring to. It was one of several things that existed in the category of shared knowledge that didn't require revisiting in a consultation room in Ohio. "Why are you here?" she asked. Not an accusation, just a direct question. She had always asked direct questions, even when she was a second-year corpsman with no rank and no business asking her commanding officer anything. "Routine stop," Caldwell said. "I was in Columbus for a Defense Health Agency briefing. Drove back through Milford because I had a meeting scheduled at the Veterans Clinic on Archer Street." He paused. Something moved across his face that was not quite an emotion, but was its structural shadow. "The clinic is 3 blocks from this hospital. I heard the radio traffic. Military police monitoring." "Of course," his voice didn't change. "He assaulted you in a functioning emergency department in front of 40 witnesses, Calloway. That wasn't a gray area. That wasn't something I could drive past." "I had it managed," she said. I know you did. He said it without argument, without any hesitation. That's not why I came in. I came in because a man in a uniform put his hands on someone I serve with. And some things don't change based on whether you're still active duty. Lee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he's going to say it was a compliance situation, that I was being combative, that he was managing an uncooperative employee. He can say whatever he'd like from the holding room at Milford County Sheriff's Office, where he'll be for the next several hours. Caldwell's voice carried the particular precision of a man who had already thought several moves past this conversation. The department will want to protect him. That's predictable. What's also predictable is that the Judge Advocate General's office is currently making a call to the Milford Police Department. Assault on a former service member during the performance of medical duty falls under a federal statute that their internal review process does not have authority to dismiss. Lee absorbed that. You moved fast. I had people on the phone before the doors closed behind me. She nodded once. The kind of nod that carries multiple things at once: understanding, gratitude, and underneath both of those, the quiet weight of wishing it hadn't been necessary. Your staff, Caldwell said. They didn't know your background. No. Does anyone here know? She considered. Dex Porter, the charge nurse. He knows I did military medical work. I didn't give him specifics. She paused. I don't give specifics. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a person looks at someone they've known long enough to see clearly. That's going to change today. I know. How do you feel about that? It was an unusual question from him. He was not, generally, a man who checked in on feelings. That he was asking now meant something. Like a private person, Lee said slowly, who is about to become a public story. Something around the edges of his expression acknowledged the accuracy of that. You can't put this back, Calloway. I know that too. 002400. He straightened. That subtle postural shift she recognized from 8 years of watching him transition from internal processing to external action. Internal affairs from the department will send someone here. The hospital's legal team has already been contacted, and there are 2 journalists in the parking lot who arrived approximately 9 minutes ago, which means someone in that waiting room has a smartphone and knows how to use it. Lee closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she was already recalibrated. Is there anything you need from me right now? A formal statement when you're ready, not before. He held her gaze. And Harlan is not your concern anymore. Those 5 words, spoken by this man in this room, carried a finality that most legal documents didn't achieve. She opened the consultation room door and walked back out. The next 2 hours were the strangest of her 3 years at Riverside General. Not because of the volume of activity she could manage. What was strange was the texture of it, the way people looked at her, the way they stopped looking at her, the specific recalibration happening in real time behind the eyes of people who thought they knew exactly who Lee Calloway was. Priya found her at the medication cart at 1 PM. She came without preamble, stood beside her, and then said in a rush, I should have done something earlier. When he first came to the desk, I should have backed you up, and I didn't. Lee looked at her. Priya was 29, 3 years into her nursing career, smart and competent and possessed of the particular vulnerability of someone who hadn't yet fully understood she was allowed to take up space in difficult situations. You were in a complicated position, Lee said. That's a generous way to describe freezing. It is, Lee agreed, not cruelly, not softly, just honestly. But it's also accurate. He was a uniformed officer who outweighed you by 60 pounds and was already showing aggressive behavior. Standing up to that takes a specific kind of training. You don't have that training. That's not a failure. It's a gap. Priya was quiet. What kind of training? The kind that comes from having no other option, Lee said, and she moved to the next drawer. It wasn't a closing answer, but it seemed to give Priya something to hold. She exhaled, straightened, and went back to work. 003000. Reyes found her at 2:15, between a suture case and an intake form. He didn't approach with his usual operational briskness. He stood in her path and waited until she stopped. 8 years, he said. Yes. Combat deployments. 4. He looked at her the way a man looks at a picture he thought he understood and has just realized he was holding upside down. Why didn't you? I was going to ask why you didn't mention it, but I think I already know. It's not relevant to patient care, she said. It's relevant to how people, he gestured slightly helplessly at the space around them. Talk to me, she finished. Yes, that's not a good enough reason to use it. He was quiet for a long moment. The calls you've made, he said finally, the ones that didn't make sense on paper but turned out to be right, the way you handle the bad cases. I always thought you were just… He stopped, started again. I thought it was instinct. It is, she said, trained instinct, which is just another word for practice. She moved past him, and behind her she heard him say, almost to himself, 8 years. The afternoon brought its ordinary emergencies. A man with a laceration from a belt sander, a teenager with an allergic reaction caught early, an elderly woman whose family had been watching her decline for weeks and had finally made the decision to bring her in. Lee moved through all of it with the same calibration she always moved through it, and the work itself was the steadiest thing in a day that kept producing new instabilities. Because other things were happening around the edges of the floor. At 2:30, a woman in a blazer who was not dressed for a hospital came through the main entrance and spoke to the front desk for 4 minutes before being directed toward Walsh's office. She had the specific energy of a person who asked questions for a living. At 2:50, a young lieutenant in uniform came through the ER, found Lee at the nurse's station, and handed her a folded piece of paper. She read it without expression, tucked it in her scrub pocket. At 3:10, Walsh appeared on the floor with the expression of a man who needed to say something and was struggling to find the least uncomfortable version of it. "Do you have 2 minutes?" he asked. She followed him to his glass-walled alcove near the corridor. He sat. She didn't. "The board is convening an emergency session at 4, he said. "About today, about what we learned today about your background." He shifted. "There are things in your service record that are apparently classified, which means our standard background check didn't." "Gerald," she said. He stopped. "What do you actually want to say to me? Not what the board needs to say, not what legal wants on record. What do you want to say?" He was quiet for a moment. Gerald Walsh was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 20 years managing institutional complexity, which had a way of eroding directness the way water erodes stone. But sitting in that small glass office with the events of the day pressing in from every direction, some of that erosion seemed to reverse. "I'm sorry," he said. "When he was in your face at the desk this morning, I was calculating. I was more worried about the department relationship than about you. And while I was calculating, he stopped." "I know," she said. "That's not acceptable." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She held his eyes. "But I also know you didn't build yourself, Gerald. Institutions train people to protect the institution. That's a problem with the institution, not only with you." He looked at her with a kind of worn gratitude that was the most genuinely human thing she'd seen in this conversation. "The board is going to talk about a formal apology," he said. "Some kind of recognition or…" "I don't want a ceremony." She said it without heat. "I want updated triage protocol posted at every entrance. I want a written policy about law enforcement interactions that makes clear officers do not direct patient priority in this building. And I want security staff to receive training that explicitly covers situations involving uniformed personnel." She held his gaze. "That's what today should produce." Walsh blinked. Then he reached for his notepad. "Let me write that down," he said. 004200. She was back on the floor by 3:20. Emma was doing better, well enough that Reyes had moved her from Bay 4 to a proper room upstairs. Before the transport, Sarah Briggs had found Lee at the station and stood in front of her without speaking for a moment. Then she had done something Lee hadn't prepared for. She took Lee's hand in both of hers and held it briefly, the way people hold something that could have been lost. "Thank you," Sarah said. Lee gave one small, genuine nod. "Go take care of your daughter." The elevator doors closed on Emma's transport at 3:31. The little girl's fingers were wrapped around her rabbit. Lee watched the numbers count upward, then turned back to the floor. Her phone buzzed at 4:17, a number she recognized as the Milford PD non-emergency line. Something in her chest adjusted one quiet degree before she answered. The voice was male, professional, and careful in a way that suggested it had been coached. "Nurse Calloway, this is Sergeant Drummond from Milford PD, calling to inform you that Officer Harlan was released from custody at 3:55 this afternoon, pending completion of the departmental review." Lee said nothing for a moment. "The federal matter," she said, "the JAG referral. That process is ongoing, but local holding authority defaults to the department when the federal warrant hasn't been formally issued. So he's out, placed on administrative leave, required to surrender his service weapon. But yes, ma'am, he's out." She ended the call and stood very still near the medication cart. Administrative leave, weapon surrendered, federal warrant still in progress. She knew enough about how these things moved to understand what "in progress" meant in practice. It meant variables were still in play. It meant people were still making decisions about whether what happened in that emergency room was going to be treated with the weight it deserved, or with the particular lightness that institutions sometimes discovered when they needed to protect their own. She typed a message to the number on the folded paper from Caldwell's lieutenant. "Harlan released on admin leave. Federal warrant still pending." The response came back in 30 seconds. "Aware, working it." 2 words, and they carried exactly the right amount of reassurance and exactly the right acknowledgement that it wasn't over. 005000. At 4:45, the board meeting ended, and 3 board members came to the floor, an unusual event under any circumstances. They expressed the formal apology Walsh had told her was coming. They confirmed the protocol revisions, and one of them, a woman named Harriet Odom, who had been on the Riverside board for 11 years and had the bearing of someone who had navigated significant institutional difficulty, said something more direct than the others. "We failed a duty of care today," Harriet said. "Not a procedural duty, a human one. An apology doesn't correct the mechanism that allowed it to happen. That's why the protocol changes matter and why they will be implemented and verified, not just written down." Lee looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that." "I know you do," Harriet said, "which is why we should have protected you better." At 5:30, her shift ended. She changed in the locker room, moving through the familiar end-of-shift motions, the deliberate unpacking of the day that nurses and doctors develop as a way of not carrying the hospital home with them. She sat on the bench in front of her locker, with her jacket in her hands, and let herself exist without managing anything for exactly 30 seconds. Then her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. "Milford area code," she answered. "Calloway." The voice was younger, male, slightly rushed. "My name is Officer Theo Elkins. We met today. I was with Officer Harlan this morning." The young one, the one who had gone rigid near the door, who had said, "Todd, come on," in a voice with no weight behind it. "I remember," Lee said. "I filed a full witness statement," Elkins said, "voluntarily, before anyone asked me to. Everything I saw this morning, I put it in writing at 2:15. A pause. "I also want to say, I should have stepped in. When he first grabbed your arm, I froze. And I know there's no explanation that you were a junior officer watching your senior colleague act outside protocol, Lee said. The psychology of that situation is well documented. What matters is what you did after. A silence. Then, he called me, about an hour ago, from his car. Lee's attention sharpened. What did he say? Elkins hesitated. The specific hesitation of someone choosing between loyalty to an institution that no longer deserved it and the simple weight of what was true. He said you were going to regret making this a bigger deal than it needed to be. Another pause. He said some people get exactly what's coming to them. The locker room was very quiet. Did he say anything else? He said the Admiral wasn't going to be in Milford forever. She absorbed that. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was even. Thank you for calling me, she said. What are you going to do? She thought about the federal warrant still processing, about Caldwell working angles she didn't have full visibility into, about a reporter somewhere in the parking lot with a smartphone and questions, about a child upstairs breathing normally for the first time all day. I'm going to go back to work tomorrow, she said. She ended the call. She stood. She was almost to the locker room door when her phone buzzed again. Not Elkins, not Caldwell, not any Milford area code. A Maryland exchange. She looked at it for 3 full seconds because she knew that exchange, had known it for years without ever expecting to see it appear on her personal phone in a hospital locker room in Ohio. It was a Pentagon number. She stared at it, and then, on the 4th ring, she pressed answer. The voice that came through was a woman's, measured, articulate, with the particular cadence of someone accustomed to delivering significant information to people who were not sitting down, without suggesting that sitting down was necessary. Nurse Calloway, this is Commander Patricia Wren, Office of the Judge Advocate General, Naval Criminal Investigative Service Liaison. I apologize for reaching you on a personal line. Admiral Caldwell provided the number. Lee's free hand pressed flat against the locker behind her. Not for support, just for the orientation of something solid. Commander, she said, I'll be brief because I know today has been considerable and you have limited bandwidth right now. But what I need to tell you cannot wait until tomorrow, and I wanted you to hear it from this office before it appeared somewhere else. Go ahead. The federal assault charge against Officer Brett Harlan was filed at 4:40 this afternoon. Approximately 20 minutes after you were notified, he'd been released locally. The warrant is active. Milford PD has been formally notified. A federal marshal has been dispatched. He will be in federal custody by tomorrow morning at the latest. Lee's eyes were on the middle distance, processing. That's the first piece, she said. Yes, a brief pause. Not hesitation, more the structural pause of someone sequencing information carefully. The second piece is more complicated, and it's why I'm calling personally rather than having someone relay it. Tell me. During the review of today's incident, NCIS ran a standard cross-check on Harlan's record. Protocol when an active or former service member is involved in a federal matter. What came back was not what we expected. Another pause. Harlan has a prior complaint history, 3 other incidents at medical facilities in this region over the past 5 years, 2 nurses and 1 paramedic. None of them filed charges that stuck. The locker room felt very still. He did this before, Lee said, not a question. The prior complaints were filed internally with the department and processed through departmental review, which in Milford is handled by the department itself. So they were buried. The word the department would use is resolved. Wren's tone made clear precisely what she thought of that word in this context. What this means for you practically is that your case is no longer an isolated incident. It is the 4th in a documented pattern. Patterns carry significantly more legal weight than single events. Lee let that settle. She thought about the 3 people who had come before her. 2 nurses, a paramedic. People who had filed complaints that went through the departmental review process and were never heard from again. She thought about what that cost looked like, not just professionally. "Were any of them contacted today?" she asked. "That process is beginning now. I wanted to reach you first." "Why?" The question was genuine, not rhetorical. Wren seemed to understand that. "Because you are the most visible point in this case. The others had no one like Admiral Caldwell walk into the room, which means you have a platform they didn't have. And what you do with it over the next 48 hours will affect how much room those three people have to come forward." Lee understood the architecture of what Wren was describing with the clarity of someone who had, in different contexts, understood exactly how one visible case could either clear a path for others or close it off, depending entirely on how it was handled. "What do you need from me?" "A formal, recorded statement, in person. Tomorrow, if you can manage it, we can send someone to Milford. I'm on shift at noon. We can work around that." A brief pause. "Nurse Calloway, I want you to understand something clearly. The federal case proceeds with or without your active cooperation. The evidence is strong enough, but your testimony changes the scope of what we can pursue, not just against Harlan individually, but against the department itself. You're talking about institutional liability. I'm talking about a department that has been protecting a pattern of behavior for 5 years. Whether we can reach them depends on the strength and specificity of your account." Lee was quiet for 6 seconds. "I'll be ready at 8, she said. "We'll see you then." Wren's voice shifted fractionally. The professional register stayed in place, but something more direct came through underneath it. "And for what it's worth, what you did in that triage room today was correct. You protected the right patient. I know you know that, but someone outside that hospital should say it anyway." The call ended. Lee stood in the locker room for another 30 seconds, doing the specific internal work of a person processing a significant expansion of something they thought they already understood the shape of. Then she put the phone in her bag, shouldered it, and walked out. She didn't go home immediately. She drove for 20 minutes in the direction of her apartment, then pulled onto a side street 2 blocks away and sat with the engine running and the radio off. 10 minutes. Not meditation, not processing in the therapeutic sense, just the deliberate, temporary suspension of forward motion orientation that got her through difficult operational periods. You stopped. You let the system catch up to itself. You didn't resolve anything. You simply let the information settle where it was going to settle. What she had at the end of 10 minutes was this. The federal charge was active. The warrant was in motion. Harlan's pattern had been surfaced and was being treated as the structural problem it was. Caldwell was working channels she didn't have full visibility into. The hospital had committed to protocol changes. Wren was building a case that reached past Harlan to the department itself. These were facts, mostly good ones. Also entirely in motion, which meant unstable, which meant something could still go wrong. The thing that could go wrong was Harlan himself. She picked up her phone and called Caldwell. He answered on the second ring. "Wren called me," she said. "I know, I told her to." "What aren't you telling me about Harlan's current location?" A measured pause, the specific pause of a man deciding how much to give. "He's not in Milford. As of 2 hours ago, he drove west on Route 33. His credit card was used at a gas station in Clarksburg." "You're tracking him." "We're monitoring public information that became relevant the moment a federal warrant was filed. His phone is not being tracked. We don't have authority for that yet. But credit card activity and traffic camera data are accessible. He's running. He may be driving. Those aren't the same thing yet. Where's he going?" Another pause, more deliberate this time. "His brother lives in Clarksburg. Raymond Harlan, retired county deputy. Off the force for 2 years following a conduct review." A beat. "The brother is a man who understands the system and has reason to be hostile to federal intervention." Lee absorbed that. "So he's going to someone who knows how to help him navigate this." That's a possibility. High enough that I have a conversation going with the Harrison County Sheriff's Office right now. The federal marshal is aware. She exhaled slowly. This is going to take longer than tonight. Most things do. You need to sleep. The NCIS team will be with you at 8. I know. Calloway. He only used her first name in specific circumstances. She recognized the register immediately. What? What you did today, and I don't mean the confrontation. I mean the triage call, the child. That's the thing that holds all of this together. Harlan was going to be Harlan regardless of who was standing at that desk. But the reason that room remembers today differently is because a sick child got the right care at the right moment. That's not incidental. That's the whole shape of what happened. She was quiet. I know, she said. Good. 8 o'clock. Sleep. He ended the call. She slept 7 hours. When she woke at 6:20, she lay still for a moment, registering the particular quality of the morning light coming through the curtains. Then she got up, made coffee, and read everything. The video from the waiting room was at 140,000 views. Someone had screenshotted a frame of it and added text in large white letters across the top. 4-star Admiral shuts down cop who choked ER nurse. She looked at it for 4 seconds and put the phone face down. The NCIS team arrived at 7:52. 2 of them, a senior investigator named Calloway and a younger analyst named Torres, both in plain clothes, both carrying the professional composure of people trained to read rooms, and people quickly and accurately. They came up, accepted coffee, set up a recording device on her kitchen table with the efficient respect of people who understood they were in someone's personal space and were not going to behave like they owned it. The statement took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Lee spoke with the precise, structured recall of someone who had filed operational reports and given mission debriefs in environments considerably higher stakes than a kitchen in Milford, Ohio. Not because this was the same thing, because the muscles were the same. She gave times, positions, verbal exchanges as close to verbatim as she could reconstruct. The physical sequence of what Harlan had done and in what order. The physiological experience of the compression on her throat. At one point, Calloway asked, "At any moment during the confrontation, did you feel your life was in danger?" Lee considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, rather than the reflexive binary it sometimes prompted. I assessed that if the intervention had been delayed by approximately another 90 seconds, she said, I would have experienced loss of consciousness from compression asphyxia. Whether Harlan's intent was to reach that outcome, or whether he simply lacked the self-awareness to understand what his actions were producing, I cannot testify to intent. I can testify to trajectory. Calloway looked at her steadily. That's an unusually precise answer. I have an unusually specific frame of reference, she said. He nodded, wrote something, moved on. At 10:35, the session ended. Calloway capped his pen. The 3 prior complainants, Lee said, have they been contacted? All 3 were reached yesterday evening. 2 are willing to provide statements. The 3rd hasn't responded yet. What happened to them after the complaints? Calloway held her gaze. One was transferred to a different department within the same hospital network. One left nursing entirely within 8 months of the incident. The room was quiet. She left nursing, Lee said. She's working in medical billing administration in Dayton. Lee held that information in the exact space it deserved. The specific weight of it was unmistakable, the shape of something lost. A career redirected not by choice, but by the accumulated cost of an event that was supposed to have been handled and was not. Make sure her statement is treated with the same weight as mine, she said. All statements carry equal. I'm not talking about legal weight, she kept her eyes on his. I'm talking about attention, resources, follow-through. She left her career because the system failed to protect her. If this investigation treats her case as supporting material for mine, rather than a full account in its own right, You will be repeating that failure. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Understood, he said. They packed their equipment. Torres thanked her and moved toward the door. Calloway stopped with his hand on the frame. There's going to be a joint press briefing this afternoon at 3. Federal and local. Your name will be mentioned. We don't have a mechanism to prevent that, but you won't be required to attend or comment. I know, she paused. I've been in contact with a reporter from the Milford Courier. He looked slightly surprised. You're giving an interview? I'm thinking about it. There's a specific story that should be told about what triage protocol means and why it exists. If someone's going to be talking about what happened in that ER, I'd rather it be accurate. That's your call entirely, Calloway said. Good luck today, Nurse Calloway. She was on the floor by 11:45. The ER at Riverside General was different on a Wednesday. Not primarily because of what had happened the day before, though that was everywhere, in the way people moved through the space, in the extra attentiveness, in the history that hadn't been there 48 hours ago. It was different the way spaces are always different after extraordinary things happen in them. The ground hadn't fully resettled. Priya was already there, working the neighboring station with a visible deliberateness, the specific quality of someone practicing a thing they intended to get right. Reyes stopped by at noon exactly. Emma's being discharged Friday, he said. Her mom asked me to tell you. Good. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man still reassembling a picture. How are you actually doing? I'm on the floor and I know what needs to happen, she said. That's the answer. He seemed to hear something in it that he hadn't heard before. Not evasion, not armor, just the genuine perspective of someone for whom functioning well and doing fine were the same thing, because enough high-pressure experience had collapsed the distance between them. Flag me if you need anything, he said, and moved to the next bay. At 1:15, her phone buzzed. Caldwell's lieutenant. She stepped into the consultation alcove. What happened? The federal marshal located Harlan at the brothers' property in Clarksburg at 10:20 this morning, taken into custody without incident. He's being processed at the federal building in Columbus. She felt something release in her chest, quiet and structural, like a load she hadn't consciously been carrying. Without incident, she said, completely cooperative. Apparently, the brother told him to turn himself in. A pause. We think the brother may be trying to negotiate some separation from liability. Smart, she said without heat. Admiral Caldwell wanted you to know before the 3 o'clock briefing. Thank you. She came back out and went back to work. The afternoon press briefing, she watched 90 seconds of it on her phone in the break room, was conducted by a federal prosecutor named Sears, who delivered the statement with the measured, compressed language of someone who understood that the more precisely you described a thing, the less room there was for someone else to re-describe it. Federal charges, pattern of behavior, departmental liability under investigation. He used the word survivor once in reference to Lee. She made a quiet, private note of that, not because she objected, but because it was a word that carried weight she hadn't entirely decided how to carry yet. By 3:30, the waiting room television had the briefing running on 2 different channels. Every few minutes, someone in the lobby looked up at the screen and then across the floor to where Lee was working. She felt those looks the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Not with alarm, with the somatic awareness of something that had shifted around her without her moving. At 4:50, a man she didn't recognize came through the main entrance. Late 30s, carrying his left arm with the involuntary protective curl of someone with shoulder pain he'd been ignoring too long. He came to the triage desk, and Lee looked up from her charting, and he looked at her with the specific, searching expression of someone who has seen a face on a screen and is now reconciling it with the person in front of him. "Are you Nurse Calloway?" he asked. "I am." He seemed to exhale. "I drove here from Clarksburg," he said. "My name is Raymond Harlan." Every person within earshot went still. Lee did not, She looked at Brett Harlan's brother, the retired county deputy, the man whose address had been the terminal point of a federal chase this morning, the man who had told his brother to turn himself in, and he looked back at her with the expression of someone standing at the far end of a series of decisions he could not undo, holding the weight of them in a way that was visibly uncomfortable. "I'm not here to—" He stopped, started again. "I don't entirely know what I'm here for. I told Brett to turn himself in this morning. He's going to spend years getting out from under this. I know that." He paused. "I wanted to see you." "Why?" Lee said. Simple, no inflection. He looked at the floor, then back up. "Because I've been in that room before," he said. "Not this hospital, a different one, 4 years ago. Different situation, but the same." He pressed his lips together. "I filed a complaint. Nothing happened. I left the force because I couldn't—" He stopped again. "I didn't know he was doing it too. That's not an excuse. I just didn't know." The floor continued around them. Monitors from the far bays. Someone being moved on a gurney. All of it on its ordinary tracks while this specific moment occupied its own still pocket in the middle of the day. "The NCIS team will want to talk to you," Lee said. "I know. I called them before I drove here." He swallowed. "I have records, things that go back further than what happened at that hospital. When we were kids, our father—" He stopped. Something moved across his face that was complicated and human, and not her burden to carry. But she absorbed it anyway, because she was built that way, and she had never entirely been able to stop. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you're the one who finally made it matter." He held her gaze. "And I thought you should know you're not the first, and also that some of us who should have stopped it earlier, we're trying to do the right thing now, even though now is too late to be the right time." From the break room doorway, Priya appeared. She saw Lee at the desk, saw the man she was talking to, and stopped. Her face asked a question without words. Lee gave the smallest, steadiest nod. "I have it." Priya went back to work. Lee looked at Raymond Harlan. "Go home," she said. "Make sure you're available when NCIS calls. And if you know anyone else who filed a complaint that disappeared, give them those names." He nodded twice, quickly, the way people nod when they're managing something larger than a nod can accommodate. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "That's not mine to accept or decline," she said. "Direct it somewhere useful." He left. She went back to work. At 6:20, 14 minutes before the end of her shift, the ambulance bay doors opened and a gurney came through fast. Paramedics at a full, controlled run. The specific compressed urgency of a team that has done everything in their power to keep a window open and is now delivering it to the people who can go further. Lee moved without thinking, the way the body moves when training has gone deep enough that it no longer routes through deliberation. The patient was a man, mid-60s, cardiac event confirmed by the paramedics, who pressed an EKG strip into her hand as she fell into step beside the gurney. She read it in 2 seconds while moving. ST elevation, anterior, the unmistakable signature of a blockage in the left anterior descending artery. The one the cardiology community called the widowmaker, not for dramatic effect, but for statistical accuracy. "STEMI, LAD," she called out, already reaching for the alert panel. "I need the cath lab on alert, cardiology on call, and Bay 1 cleared right now." The floor responded. It always responded, because the floor was full of people who knew how to do this, and what made a trauma floor function was not any single person, but the aggregate efficiency of trained professionals responding to clear information delivered correctly. Reyes came out of Bay 2. "What do we have?" 63-year-old male, witness collapse, onset approximately 19 minutes ago. EKG shows anterior STEMI. He needs the cath lab in under 30 minutes. Is he conscious? Borderline. She was already at the head of the gurney. Pulse present, irregular. Aspirin given in the field. No thrombolytics. The man on the gurney had his eyes open partially. He was looking at the ceiling with a slightly unfocused expression of someone not entirely certain where they were. Lee leaned over him so he could see her face. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes found hers, and something in them steadied. "You're at Riverside General," she said. "We know what's happening, and we're moving fast. You are not alone." His hand moved blindly at his side. She let him hold her arm for exactly 5 seconds while the cardiology resident arrived, while the bay was being cleared, while the cath lab called back with confirmation. Then she gently disengaged, handed the patient off with a complete verbal report, and stepped back. Reyes looked at her across the bay. "Good catch. Good field team," she said. She was writing the handoff notes when her phone buzzed. Dana Kirsch, the reporter from the Milford Courier, who had been in the parking lot yesterday and had handed her a card with the patient confidence of someone who had learned that waiting was sometimes more effective than pushing. Lee stood with her pen hovering over the intake form. She thought about what Kirsch had said the day before. The story is about what happened when you did your job correctly, and a man with authority decided that wasn't acceptable. She thought about the nurse in Dayton who now worked in medical billing. She thought about the paramedic who had filed a complaint that got resolved. She thought about the man on the gurney who was currently being wheeled toward a cath lab because someone on this floor had read an EKG strip in 2 seconds and called it right. She answered. "Miss Kirsch," she said, "I'll talk to you, but I have terms." A brief beat of surprise on the other end. Then Kirsch recalibrated, her voice settling into the register of a journalist who had worried this call wasn't coming and was not going to show that. "I'm listening." "I'm not the center of the story," Lee said. "The triage protocol is. The pattern is. The 3 people who came before me are. If you write it that way, I'll give you everything I can without compromising the federal case." Kirsch paused. "Yes," she said, "that works. That's actually a better story." "I know it is," Lee said. "That's why I called you." She was finishing the scheduling details when Priya touched her arm. "Lee," the specific tone that meant something was happening that required attention and didn't fit a known category. Lee looked up. At the main entrance to the emergency room, a small group of people had gathered. 7, maybe 8, street clothes, carrying nothing, standing in the particular posture of people who have traveled some distance, internally and geographically, to arrive at a specific place and are not entirely sure how to begin now that they're here. Lee recognized one of them, a woman, maybe 32, a hospital ID badge from a different facility clipped to her coat. A face Lee had seen in the NCIS brief that morning, in a photograph 3 years old and slightly faded. The formal headshot on a nursing license registration, one of the prior complainants. The nurse who had been transferred and then had left nursing entirely. The woman from Dayton who now worked in medical billing. She was here, and behind her stood 6 more people, all carrying the same compound expression. The expression of people who have held something difficult in private for a long time and have come to a place where they no longer have to hold it alone. Lee stood very still. Her phone was still in her hand, the line with Kirsch still technically open. She put it back to her ear. "Miss Kirsch," she said, watching the group at the entrance. "Change of plans. Don't come tomorrow." A pause. "Come now." Kirsch arrived in 11 minutes, fast enough that Lee calculated she had either been in her car already or had been close enough to the hospital that the call had essentially summoned her from around the corner. She came through the main entrance in her blazer, phone already in hand, and stopped just inside the doors when she saw what Lee had seen. 8 people standing in the ER lobby with the particular stillness of people who had traveled some distance, internally and geographically, to arrive at a specific place. Lee was already moving toward them. The woman she had recognized from the NCIS brief was named Sonia Hartwell, 31 years old, nursing degree from Ohio State, had worked at a regional hospital in Canton before the incident with Harlan, had filed a complaint that was processed by the Milford Police Department's internal review and returned to her 3 weeks later with the word unfounded stamped across the top in red ink. Had left nursing 14 months after that, had moved to Dayton, had not walked into a hospital in any professional capacity in 18 months. She was here now. The way she held herself, straight, deliberate, the careful posture of someone who had dressed for something they were afraid of doing and done it anyway, told Lee more than any file. "Nurse Calloway," Sonia said. Her voice was steady in the way voices are steady when steadiness is a decision rather than a default. "You drove from Dayton," Lee said, 2 hours and 10 minutes. A small pause. "I saw the press briefing at 3, then I made some calls." She glanced briefly at the 7 people behind her. Some of them I knew, some I found through a complaint network. When they said it was you, when they said the federal case was real and moving, she stopped. I needed to be in the room. Lee looked at the group, 7 people, 4 women, 3 men, ages ranging from late 20s to mid-50s, a mix of clinical and street clothes. 2 still in scrubs as though they had come directly from a shift. 1 man had a folded document in his hand. 1 woman was holding her phone with both hands, knuckles slightly tighter than neutral. They were not victims presenting their victimhood. They were people who had been ignored once and had come to a place where being ignored again was not the guaranteed outcome. "I'm Lee Calloway," she said to the group. Not loudly, she didn't perform volume. "You all know why you're here. I'm not going to pretend I was expecting you tonight, but I'm not surprised either." She let that settle. "The NCIS team that took my statement this morning is reachable. Anyone who wants to give a formal statement, I can facilitate that connection before you leave." She paused. "But before we do that, is there anyone here who isn't sure they want to?" Silence. No one moved. "Okay," she said. Kirsch had positioned herself near the edge of the group, present, observant, not inserting herself, with the practiced restraint of someone who understood her job right now was to watch and remember. Lee caught her eye for 1 second and gave the smallest nod. "You can be here, but this is theirs first." Kirsch nodded back. Her phone stayed in her pocket, not her hand. What followed was not a meeting, not a press opportunity, not a debrief with a structure and a timeline. It was something harder to categorize. 8 people and Lee Calloway in the family consultation room at the end of the East Corridor, seated in beige chairs with 2 more dragged in from the hallway, talking about things that had happened to them in the language of people who have held those things for years and have never been given a proper container to put them in. Lee did not lead it. She sat and she listened. When someone asked her a direct question, she answered directly. When someone's account started to lose structural confidence, she asked a question that gave it traction again. Not therapy, not performance. Just the focused attention of someone trained to gather accurate information under pressure. The man with the folded document was a paramedic named Garrett Cole. He had filed a complaint 2 years ago following an incident at a trauma pickup where Harlan had physically blocked him from accessing a patient in a dispute about crime scene jurisdiction. Garrett had been shoved. He had filed. The complaint had been resolved. 3 weeks after the resolution, he had received an anonymous message on his personal phone. He unfolded the document and placed it on the table. It was a printout of a text, photographed and time-stamped, kept for 2 years in a folder he had moved through 3 apartments without ever opening. The text read, "Accidents happen to people who make waves." "I don't know if it's enough," Garrett said. "That's evidence of witness intimidation," Lee said. "That's a separate federal charge. Give that to NCIS tonight." He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it with the careful precision of someone archiving something valuable. Sonia spoke last. She had been listening through most of the hour, hands flat on her knees, processing other people's accounts against the template of her own. When she finally talked, she did not give a narrative. She gave facts. Dates, times, what Harlan had said, what he had done, how she had documented it, and what had happened to the documentation. The clipped, deliberate structure of someone who had rehearsed the account so many times in private that it had been worn smooth. All the raw edges polished off by repetition into something that could be spoken without breaking. At the end of it, she was quiet. Then she said, "I left my job because I was afraid it would happen again. And next time, no Admiral was going to walk through the door." The room held that. "I'm not going back to nursing," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because I want my career back. I'm here because what happened to me was part of a pattern, and the pattern kept going after me, and now someone finally has the weight to stop it." She looked at Lee. "I want to be on record as one of the reasons it stopped." Lee held her gaze. "You will be," she said. It was almost 9 when the consultation room emptied. Lee had made calls. Calloway at NCIS answered on the second ring with the careful professional restraint of someone who genuinely could not believe the day's momentum, but was refusing to show it. Arrangements were made for formal statements from all 8 individuals over the following 2 days. At the end of the call, Calloway told her that the Milford PD's chief had been contacted by the federal prosecutor's office that afternoon and had requested a meeting for tomorrow morning. That meeting, Calloway said, was not optional. Lee relayed that information to Kirsch as they stood near the nurses' station at 9:03, the ER floor running its nocturnal register around them. "The department meeting," Kirsch said, "that's the institutional piece. That's the piece that produces systemic change, or doesn't. Individual charges are necessary but not sufficient," Lee said. "Harlan going to federal holding is necessary. The department being held accountable for 3 complaints they buried is what changes the next version of this." Kirsch was writing in her notebook. The physical kind, worn journalist notebook. Lee registered that with the quiet, professional respect of someone also trained to keep physical records when electronic ones might be compromised. "Can I use what you just said?" "That's why I said it." Kirsch wrote it down. Then she looked up with the expression of someone crossing from professional to direct. "The story I'm going to write is going to be significant. The pattern, the suppression, the intimidation, the federal case, the people who came here tonight. This is not a local story anymore. This goes national, possibly within 48 hours. She paused. "And you are going to be part of it, whether or not you're the center of it." "I'm not the center," Lee said. "I know, but people are going to know your name. The video has over 300,000 views as of an hour ago." Lee absorbed that number with the focused stillness of someone absorbing a piece of information that changes the speed of something already in motion. "Here's what I'll give you on background," she said. "The military context is relevant to this story in one way only. Not because it made me more worth protecting, because it exposes the logic of why he thought he could." She held Kirsch's gaze. "He looked at me and ran a calculation. The calculation was wrong. That's the story, not the credentials." Kirsch wrote that down. "On the record," Lee continued, "I'll give you the triage decision, the protocol, what it means and why it exists. And I'll give you Sonia Hartwell's name, with her permission, as the person this story starts with, not me." Kirsch looked up. "You want her to be the lead?" "I want the pattern to be the lead, and she was the first documented point in that pattern." Lee held her eyes. "Talk to her before you file anything. Let her shape what she once said about herself." Kirsch was quiet for a moment. Then she capped her pen and looked at Lee with an expression that was professional respect, carrying something more personal underneath it. "Most people in your position would take the center frame. You have a 4-star admiral vouching for you, a federal case, 300,000 people who've seen the video. You could." "I could be a headline," Lee said. "I know." She looked at Kirsch steadily. "I'm a nurse. That's the whole answer. It was the whole answer yesterday, and it's the whole answer tonight." The story ran on the Milford Courier website at 6:12 the following morning. By 8, it had been picked up by 2 national wire services. Lee read it at her kitchen counter over black coffee, standing, and read it twice, once for accuracy and once for the shape of it. Kirsch had gotten the structure exactly right. The lead was Sonia Hartwell, unnamed in the opening paragraph but described with enough specificity to be real. A nurse who had filed a complaint 3 years ago and received an unfounded determination and left her career 14 months later. The story moved through the pattern chronologically, 4 complainants across 5 years, each one processed by the same internal mechanism, each one absorbed and neutralized. Then the events of Tuesday morning, the triage decision, the confrontation, the intervention, the arrest. Then the federal case. Then the 8 people who had come to Riverside General the previous evening. Lee's name appeared 6 times. Admiral Caldwell appeared twice. Sonia Hartwell's name, with her permission, confirmed in a text sent to Lee at midnight, appeared 4 times. The final paragraph was a quote extracted from the consultation room conversation and rendered with the exact tone and cadence Lee had intended. Triage protocol exists because medicine has to be protected from authority. When someone with a badge tells you to prioritize the wrong patient, they're not just wrong about procedure, they're wrong about what a hospital is for. Her phone had 42 unread notifications by the time she finished reading. She put it in her bag and drove to work. 2:34. The Milford Police Department's press briefing happened at 10 that morning. Lee was on the floor when it began and heard about it in real time through Priya, who was checking her phone between patients with increasing frequency, and through Dex, back for day shift coverage, who stood near the nurse's station with the expression of a man watching something long overdue arrive. The chief's name was Raymond Kowalski. He had been chief for 8 years. He stood at the briefing podium with the controlled composure of a man doing extremely heavy labor with extremely limited tools. He announced the termination of Brett Harlan's employment, effective immediately. He announced the suspension, pending investigation, of 2 supervisory officers who had processed the prior complaints. He announced the formation of an independent review panel to examine the department's complaint resolution procedures over the preceding 7 years. He did not say sorry. What he said was, the department acknowledges failures in its review process that resulted in harm to complainants, and those failures will be addressed with full transparency and full accountability. It was not an apology. It was the structural shape of one, which was different and somewhat less than the thing itself. But it was public and recorded and part of the permanent account. Dex had his phone angled so Lee could see the screen while she was charting. 7 years, he said quietly. At least, she said. How many people in 7 years? She thought about that. Not the number she knew about, but the number that existed in the gap between what had been documented and what had simply been swallowed. In her experience with institutional complaint processes, the ratio of documented to actual was rarely favorable. More than we'll find, she said. At noon, Calloway called between patients. The federal arraignment had been scheduled for the following Monday. Harlan had been processed and was in federal holding. He had requested a lawyer within the first 10 minutes and had not said another word. His attorney, Calloway told her, is a former police union counsel from Columbus. Handled 3 previous officer misconduct cases, all settled quietly. He's going to try to negotiate, Lee said. He doesn't have much to negotiate with. The intimidation evidence, Garrett's message, that's a significant addition. Witness intimidation stacks on top of the assault charge and the pattern documentation. His attorney is going to have a difficult time building a coherent narrative. What about the department's liability? The independent review panel the chief announced is not technically under our jurisdiction, but the 2 suspended supervisors are persons of interest in the complaint suppression investigation, and what they say in the departmental review will inform what happens at the federal level. A beat. We're watching it. Another pause, more careful. The prior complainants, the unfounded determinations on all four original complaints, are being formally reviewed. That process can result in expungement from departmental record, and in some cases, referral for civil remediation. He paused again. Sonia Hartwell's case specifically, the career interruption, the circumstances under which she left, that's a civil matter separate from the criminal case. But it's not a small matter. She should speak to an attorney independently. I'll tell her, Lee said. She called Sonia from the break room at 12:30. Calloway thinks you have grounds for a civil case, she said. He suggested independent counsel. Sonia was quiet. I didn't come to Milford for money. I know, but a civil case isn't just about money. It's about creating a documented record that says what happened to you cost something. That matters for the people who come after. A longer silence. Okay, Sonia said finally. Do you know any attorneys? The Nursing Association's legal support network can connect you. You don't have to decide today. I know. A brief exhale. I keep thinking about the patients I used to have. Not about going back, just I think about them. She stopped. I wonder if the coverage was as good. After I left, she stopped a second time. Then when she came back, her voice was quieter. That's actually worse than thinking about myself. Lee held the phone and let that sit without filling it. If you decide you want to go back to clinical work, she said eventually, there are reinstatement pathways through the board. I can find out what that looks like. You'd do that? You left because someone failed you. That's a removable obstacle. Whether you want to remove it is your decision, but it should be your decision, not his. By mid-afternoon, the video had crossed 1 million views. Priya told her 3 times with increasing incremental astonishment. The waiting room television began showing news coverage that included the footage alongside commentary from a law enforcement analyst and a medical ethics professor from the University of Cincinnati who spoke with the precise fluency of an academic who had been thinking about exactly this issue for years and was finally being asked about it on camera. Lee watched 40 seconds of it and went back to work. At 3:45, Gerald Walsh came to the floor without his lanyard, something she had never once seen in 3 years. Without it, he looked smaller, just a man in his mid-50s moving through a floor he administered with the growing awareness that what he administered had limits he had not previously located. The board finalized the protocol changes, he said, effective immediately. Printed copies go up at each entrance today. Security training, revision is being contracted to an external firm. The board felt internal training had too many existing assumptions baked in. She had suggested external contractors. He had heard her. Good, she said. He stood holding something he hadn't said yet. The national coverage. The board has been receiving calls. Media requests mostly, but also, he paused. 11 nurses have applied for open positions here in the last 24 hours. We have 3 openings. 8 of those applications specifically mention what happened here Tuesday as the reason they applied. Lee looked at him. They want to work somewhere with that standard, he said. Somewhere a nurse can hold a triage line and be backed up. He held her gaze. You created that, whether you intended to or not. Post the protocol, she said. Back up your nurses. The applications will come. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Admiral Caldwell called the board chair this morning. He indicated the hospital's trauma care training program, the one that's been unfunded for 2 years, may qualify for a Defense Health Agency Community Partnership grant. He suggested the application come through quickly. Lee absorbed that quietly. Caldwell working something she didn't have full visibility into. He always was. Apply, she said simply. Walsh almost smiled. Already started, he said. At 5:20, with 40 minutes left in her shift, the ER doors opened and a woman came through who was not a patient and not a hospital employee. Late 40s, dark wool coat, Federal ID badge held briefly toward the front desk, the way people hold things that should explain themselves. Department of Justice, Office of Civil Rights. Her name, according to the badge, was Investigator Louise Farron. She came directly to the nurse's station. Nurse Calloway, I'm here in a preliminary capacity only. Nothing I say tonight is a formal notification. She spoke with the low, efficient register of someone who had done this enough times to have burned off all unnecessary framing. I've been reviewing the Milford PD complaint suppression situation since this morning. What I'm looking at is separate from the NCIS track. Civil rights violations, Lee said. The pattern of complaint suppression taken in conjunction with the demographic profile of the complainants. Farron paused with the precision of someone accustomed to saying difficult things carefully. 3 of the 4 documented complainants are women. 2 are women of color. The paramedic, Garrett Cole, is a black man. The demographic pattern in who was targeted and in how their complaints were processed against complaints filed by other individuals in the same period is relevant to whether this rises to a civil rights matter beyond individual assault. The floor noise continued around them. A monitor beeped. Someone in the waiting area shifted in their chair. Lee stood at the charting station with her pen in her hand and processed what Farron was describing with the recognition of someone whose field of understanding has just expanded to include a dimension they'd suspected but hadn't fully named. You're saying he's selected for vulnerability? Lee said. I'm saying the data is suggestive of a pattern that extends beyond individual aggression into something that requires civil rights examination, a more serious legal category, with different remedies and different institutional implications for the department, for the supervisors who process the complaints, potentially for individuals within the review structure who were aware of the pattern and failed to escalate. Farron paused. Potentially for more than Milford. Lee went very still. More than Milford, she repeated. Harlan worked in 2 other jurisdictions before coming here, Farron said quietly. We're making inquiries. The specific weight of that settled in the room like something structural. Not just Milford, not just 5 years. A person who had moved through institutional structures that absorbed and protected, carrying the pattern from one location to the next, the protection traveling with him. How long? Lee said. We don't know yet. Are there complaints in the other jurisdictions? There are files, Farron said, with the particular careful language of someone who had seen files that hadn't become complaints because someone had made sure they didn't. We're making inquiries. Lee set her pen down. What do you need from me tonight? Nothing. I'm here because you're the most visible point in this case, and I wanted you to hear this in person rather than through a news cycle. Farron held her gaze directly. What you do with it is your business. But if you're speaking to the press, I spoke to the Courier-Tribune last night, Lee said. The story ran this morning. I know. It's part of what put us here. A pause. What I want you to understand is that the story is larger than what that article covers. And there are more people. The words landed with the specific weight of information that makes a room feel different. Not louder, not heavier exactly, more dimensional, as though a wall you thought was exterior has turned out to be interior, and behind it is another room you didn't know existed. Tell them, Lee said. Farron produced a card, held it out. Lee took it. It joined Kirsch's card and Calloway's number and Wren's Pentagon exchange in the small collection of external contacts that the last 48 hours had deposited in her life. One more thing, Farron said. Lee waited. Harlan's attorney filed a motion this afternoon to have the federal assault charge downgraded. The argument is that his actions were consistent with standard physical compliance procedure. She paused. The motion cites your military background as a mitigating factor. The argument being that a trained military medical specialist is not a vulnerable victim under the statute, and therefore the assault should be classified at a lower threshold. The consultation room went very quiet. Lee understood the architecture of the argument immediately. It was not a stupid argument legally. It was the kind of argument that turned on a specific statutory interpretation and could be made by a competent attorney without that attorney believing it. What the argument was, underneath its legal structure, was this: she could take it. She wasn't the kind of person the law was built to protect. Therefore, what was done to her was smaller. "He used my service against me to justify attacking me," Lee said, "and now his attorney is using my service against me again to minimize what the attack meant." "Yes," Farron said simply. "What's the prosecution's response?" "That the statute applies equally regardless of the victim's professional background, and that, if anything, a trained medical specialist's precise physiological self-assessment under duress should carry more evidentiary weight, not less." Farron paused. "Your NCIS statement, the part about the 90-second trajectory to loss of consciousness, that's going to be central to the prosecution's counter-argument." Lee thought about Tuesday morning in that alcove, the specific sensation of her own airway under compression, the clinical part of her brain running the assessment in real time, duration, degree, trajectory, while the rest of her held the wall and waited for the calculation to produce its result. "Then it'll hold," she said. Farron nodded once. "Good evening, Nurse Calloway," she said, and walked back toward the entrance. Lee finished her shift at 6, stayed 20 minutes over to close 2 charts. She was in the locker room by 6:22, sitting on the bench with her jacket across her knees, doing the deliberate internal work of compartmentalizing a day that had produced more structural information than most months. The DOJ, the civil rights angle, 2 prior jurisdictions, more files, more people who had never become complaints because someone had made sure. Her phone buzzed. "Calloway. We got something from the Columbus field office an hour ago," he said. "Harlan's prior jurisdiction in Granville, a township about 35 miles east of here. There's a complaint from 4 years ago. Female nurse. Classified as inconclusive and archived without a formal hearing. Is she still there?" "She still works at Granville Regional. She was contacted 2 hours ago." A pause. "She said," and I'm quoting directly, "I've been waiting for someone to call me for 4 years." Lee closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them. "Listen to her," she said. "We are." Another beat. "There's also a complaint in his earlier record, when he was a deputy in Carlisle County 11 years ago. Filed, reviewed internally, and the complainant, a female paramedic, withdrew the complaint 3 weeks after filing. We're trying to locate her." "What happened to her?" "She moved out of state the same year she withdrew. Last known address in Portland, Oregon. We're working on contact." Lee held the phone and thought about that woman, the paramedic, 11 years ago, who had filed and then withdrawn and moved out of state that same year, who had been carrying something for 11 years that had never been acknowledged or given the simple, necessary weight of being treated as real. "When you find her," Lee said, "tell her we found her." Calloway was quiet for a moment, a small departure from his professional register, brief and quickly recovered, but there. "We will," he said. She ended the call, put on her jacket. She was almost to the locker room door when her phone buzzed again. A Carlisle County area code, a number she had never seen before. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then she answered. The voice on the other end was a woman's, older, mid-50s, with the particular vocal texture of someone who had not allowed herself to expect this call and was therefore not prepared for it, not even slightly. Managing that unpreparedness in real time with the audible effort of someone gripping something they might drop. "Is this?" The voice stopped, started again. "Is this the nurse from Milford? From Tuesday?" "Yes," Lee said. A silence long enough that she could hear the woman breathing on the other end. Unsteady, controlled with effort. The breath of someone standing at the edge of something they have been circling for a very long time. They said you were the one who... The voice broke cleanly, then assembled itself. I've been sitting by this phone for 2 hours trying to decide whether to call. Another stop. I was the paramedic in Carlisle County 11 years ago. A pause that carried the whole weight of 11 years inside it. I withdrew the complaint because they told me if I didn't, something would happen to my daughter. The locker room went completely still in Lee's memory, and the floor went completely still around her now. Priya, visible through the small window in the locker room door, looked up at Lee's face and went motionless. Lee held the phone. Her hand was steady. Her voice was steady. "Your name," she said quietly. "Tell me your name." "Ruth," the woman said. "Ruth Malone." Lee moved to the consultation alcove at the end of the station. 3 steps, a pivot, the glass door pulled shut behind her. She stood with the phone pressed to her ear and let Ruth Malone talk. And it came out the way things come out after 11 years of compression. Not neatly, not in sequence, with stops and restarts and the fractured quality of a narrative that had been rehearsed so many times in private that it had lost its linear structure and existed now as a set of images and precise details preserved in the high-definition manner of traumatic memory. Her daughter had been 6 years old. The threat had been specific and operational. Accidents happen to single mothers who make waves. Almost word for word what Garrett Cole had received 2 years ago in Milford, which meant it was not improvised. It was a script, a practiced deterrent, deployed with the confidence of something that had always worked. Until now. "Ruth," Lee said when the account had run its course, "I need you to call NCIS tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Can you do that?" A silence then. "Yes." "Is your daughter safe?" "She's 17. A pause that carried 11 years moving through it. "She doesn't know." "You don't have to tell her anything until you're ready," Lee said. "Call the number first." She gave Calloway's direct line from memory. "The people at that number are going to take what you have seriously. I need you to believe that going into the call." "Why should I?" Ruth said. Not hostile, just the honest, exhausted question of a person who had been given a reason not to believe it 11 years ago and had been carrying that lesson ever since. "Because it's already happening," Lee said. "Because 6 people in Milford gave statements last night. Because a federal warrant was issued and executed. Because the DOJ is already asking questions about Carlisle County." She paused. "Because you called me, and something in you already knows this time is different." The line was quiet. "Okay," Ruth said. The word came out rough and quiet and absolutely certain. Lee texted Calloway immediately after ending the call. "Ruth Malone, Carlisle County paramedic. She'll call you within the hour. She has documents. She received a direct threat against her child. Same language as the Garrett Cole message. This was a script. I'm sending you the details now." Calloway's response came back in 35 seconds. "On it. Go home, Calloway." She looked at the words for a moment. Then she rubbed the notes she'd written on her wrist and walked back out to the floor. She slept 8 hours without setting an alarm. When she woke at 6:40, the apartment was quiet, and the October light coming through the curtains was the thin, early kind that hadn't yet committed to warmth. She lay still for 3 minutes. Not the deliberate decompression exercise of the past several evenings, just the ordinary human moment of a person registering that they exist and that the day is beginning. Then she got up, made coffee, and read everything. The Milford Courier follow-up piece had run at 11 the previous night. Kirsch had filed it incorporating the DOJ development, the Granville complainant, and, with her full permission confirmed in a text sent at midnight, Ruth Malone. Named, in her own words. The follow-up had been picked up by 16 national outlets by 6 in the morning. The federal prosecutor's office had issued a statement confirming the scope of the Greer investigation had expanded beyond Milford and that additional charges were under consideration. 4 words in that statement hit differently than the rest. Pattern of deliberate concealment. The police union had issued a counterstatement expressing concern about due process and confidence in the internal review. Lee read it once, registered it for what it was, an institution still trying to maintain a posture the ground beneath it could no longer support, and moved on. 3 police accountability organizations had already cited the Milford case by name. One of them had posted a side-by-side comparison of all 4 original complaints, their dates, their dispositions, and the names of the reviewing supervisors. All public record, just never assembled in the same frame before. She showered, dressed, and called Caldwell. He answered on the first ring, which meant he was already at his desk. "Ruth Malone," she said. "Callaway briefed me at 1 in the morning. The supervisory connection between Carlisle County and Milford is significant." A pause. "The individual involved, his name is Dennis Pruitt, retired from the Milford Department 13 months ago, currently working private security in Cincinnati." Lee absorbed that. Retired 13 months ago, which meant he had left 4 months after Sonia Hartwell's complaint was processed as unfounded. He had connected the 2 departments, carried the methodology from one to the other. "He's the thread," she said. "That's what the evidence suggests. The federal case is no longer just Harlan. Pruitt is a person of interest in the complaint suppression investigation. Obstruction, potential conspiracy, the intimidation script that connects them directly. Is he aware? He will be this morning." A brief pause. "The federal marshal will be courteous about it." Lee sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Warren." He recognized the register immediately. She rarely used his first name. "What?" "The grant application. The Defense Health Agency Partnership for the Trauma Training Program. That's not in your jurisdiction. That's not a federal obligation. Why?" A pause, not evasive. Just the pause of a man deciding how to say something he has already decided to say. "It's a hospital that has a nurse I served with," he said, "and it has protocol changes that are going to make it a better facility than it was last week. And it has a waiting list of nursing applicants who want to work somewhere with a standard." Another pause. "Investing in that is not complicated." She held the phone and let that sit. "Thank you," she said. "Just that. Whole. No qualifier attached." "Go to work," he said. She was on the floor by 11:45. The protocol notices were up, printed on white paper in clear serif type, framed in the red border of official hospital postings, mounted at the ambulance bay entrance, the main ER entrance, and the waiting room wall. 3 sentences. Triage priority is determined solely by medical need. No external authority may override triage determination. Any person who attempts to do so will be asked to leave the clinical area. Lee stopped in front of the waiting room posting and read it once. 3 sentences that had cost a 5-year-old girl a trip to Bay 4 and a nurse's throat pressed against a wall, and 3 years of buried complaints, and 11 years of a woman in Portland carrying a threat against her daughter in a folder she couldn't throw away. 3 sentences. She went to the nurse's station. Priya was there. She straightened almost imperceptibly when she saw Lee, not with the performative deference of Tuesday morning, but with the different quality of someone who has done something and wants the person they did it for to know about it. "I attended the Nursing Association meeting this morning," she said. "The remote one was Sonia." "How was it?" "There were 11 nurses on the call, 4 different states." A pause. "I didn't know there was a formal process for documenting workplace intimidation outside the hospital's own system. I didn't know there was a peer support structure for nurses who experience coercive situations and didn't report them." She met Lee's eyes. "We should have been told." "Yes," Lee said simply. "You should have." She looked at her steadily. "I'm going to ask the board to add it to onboarding, the legal support network, the external documentation process, all of it alongside the triage protocol update." Priya exhaled, the small, specific exhale that carries more than air. "Put it in writing," she said. "I'll sign it with you." Reyes appeared from Bay 2, tablet in hand, and stopped when he saw Lee. "Emma Briggs is being discharged this afternoon," he said. "Her mother asked if you'd be available." He paused. "Also, her grandmother came to the floor this morning and introduced herself to me. Her name is Harriet Odom." Lee held the name for a moment. "The board member," she said. "Emma is her granddaughter. Jessie is Harriet's daughter." He held Lee's gaze. "Harriet told me she knew who triaged Emma on Tuesday morning and that it was the reason her granddaughter was going home. She said she wanted you to treat Emma the way you would have treated any child. That if she'd introduced herself first, she'd never have known if that was true." Lee said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tell her I'll be there." Emma was brought down at 2:50, small face pink with recovered health, stuffed rabbit in her lap, the slightly bewildered look of a 4-year-old who had been in a hospital for 3 days and was not entirely sure what the rules were in this place. Jessie walked beside the transport chair, carrying the overnight bag and the residual exhaustion of 3 days of hospital vigil. Harriet Odom was there, 70 years old, compact and silver-haired, moving with the economy of someone who had spent a lifetime making decisions and had stopped wasting motion on the ones that didn't require it. She shook Lee's hand when she saw her, and her grip was direct and firm. "I know what you do," Harriet said. "I've been on this board for 11 years, and I've watched good nurses do it every day. What I didn't know was what it cost when the people running this place failed to protect you. I intend to make sure the board understands that as an operational failure with operational consequences." "The protocol changes will help," Lee said. "The protocol changes are the floor," Harriet said, "not the ceiling." She met Lee's eyes. "I'm establishing a training fund, in Emma's name. Advanced triage training, conflict de-escalation, legal literacy for clinical staff, and a reporting structure for workplace intimidation with external teeth. You told Gerald you wanted structural change. This is what structural change looks like when the board decides to take it seriously." "Thank you," Lee said. "Don't thank me," Harriet said. "Thank whoever decided my granddaughter mattered more than a bureaucratic process." She glanced at Emma, who was peering at Lee from the transport chair with the frank, unguarded assessment of small children. Emma looked up at Lee and said, with the direct seriousness of a 4-year-old delivering important information, "I'm going home." "I know," Lee said. "You worked hard for it." Emma considered this. Then she held out the stuffed rabbit with great deliberation and placed it in Lee's hands. Jessie made a sound. "Callie, honey, that's your—" "She can have it," Emma said, with the complete authority of a child who has made up her mind. Lee looked at the small rabbit in her hands. Its ear was slightly bent. It had the worn quality of something that had been held many times in the dark. She looked at Emma. "I'll take good care of it," she said. Emma nodded, satisfied, and turned to her mother and said she wanted to go to the car. Jessie laughed. The specific, fractured laugh of a person who has been afraid for 3 days and has just been given full permission to stop, and kissed the top of her daughter's head and wheeled her toward the exit. Harriet held Lee's gaze for one more moment. "Board meeting next Thursday," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Lee said. She watched them go. She was still holding the rabbit when Dex appeared at her shoulder, coat already on, end of his shift. "Is that—" he started. "Yes," she said. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. "You know," he said, "for someone who doesn't want a ceremony—" "I don't want a ceremony. You keep ending up at the center of one anyway." She looked at him. "Go home, Dex." He grinned. A real one, the kind that reached everything, and went. The federal arraignment of Brett Harlan took place the following Monday morning in a federal courtroom in Columbus. Lee was not there. She was on the floor at Riverside General, where she belonged, managing a board with 16 patients and a first-year resident who needed guidance on a chest assessment, and an elderly man with a broken wrist who was frightened and needed someone to explain what was about to happen in language he could hold on to. Calloway texted her at 10:19. Arraigned on federal assault charge, pattern documentation entered into record. Intimidation charge formally added. Bail set at $200,000. He's not going anywhere. She read it between the wrist assessment and the chest consult, put her phone back in her pocket, and went back to the floor. The second text came at 11:45. Pruitt taken in for questioning in Cincinnati. Not under arrest yet. Persons of interest have rights. But the conversation is happening. The third text came at 2:30 from Farron at the DOJ. Preliminary findings support civil rights referral in the complaint suppression pattern. This goes to formal investigation. Timeline 60 to 90 days. I'll keep you posted. The fourth came at 4:15 from a number she had begun to recognize as Sonia Hartwell's. I spoke to an attorney. She thinks I have a strong civil case. I wanted you to know. Lee smiled at that one. Small, private. At the medication cart between two charting sessions, the fifth and final text of the day came at 5:55, 15 minutes before her shift ended. From Ruth Malone. I gave my statement to NCIS yesterday. I gave them the documents. I gave them the names. They told me the information was significant. My daughter called me last night. I told her. She said, "Mom, I can't believe you carried that alone." I said, "I had to wait until it was safe." She said, "Is it safe now?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Then I'm glad you finally told someone. I'm glad it was you." Lee read it twice. Then she put her phone away and finished her shift. 3 weeks later, the Milford Courier ran a follow-up story under Dana Kirsch's byline that occupied the front page and the first 4 pages of the print edition. The editor had called Kirsch at 11 the night before to tell her this was going to be the most read thing the paper had published in the decade he'd been there. The story was titled, "The Complaint That Never Disappeared: How One Hospital's Triage Decision Exposed 11 Years of Silenced Voices." It began with Sonia Hartwell. It moved through the 4 Milford complainants, then Garrett's intimidation message, then the Granville nurse, then Ruth Malone, named in her own words, with her own account of what had been threatened and what she had carried. It ended in Carlisle County 11 years ago, where a woman had been told that making waves had consequences for mothers and their children. The story ran with a sidebar on the Riverside General Protocol changes and the establishment of Emma's Fund. It ran with a statement from Harriet Odom about the board's commitment to structural accountability. It ran with a confirmation from the federal prosecutor's office of the expanded investigation. It ran with a no comment from the police union that was, in its silence, louder than most statements. And it ran with one extended quote from Lee, placed at the end of the main piece. Triage is not a bureaucratic procedure. It's a moral one. It says the most critical need comes first, regardless of who's asking, regardless of the badge, the title, the volume, the threat. When someone tries to override it, they're not just wrong about sequence, they're wrong about what a hospital is for. What happened here was one version of something that has happened in a lot of ERs to a lot of people who did their jobs correctly and paid for it. The only difference this time was that someone walked through the door who could make the weight of it real. That shouldn't be the difference, but it was. What I want the people who were silenced before this to understand is that it was always real. The weight was always the same. It just finally landed somewhere it couldn't be absorbed. The story was read 4 million times in the first week. In February, a nursing advocacy organization based in Washington contacted Lee. Not a ceremonial call, a substantive conversation about a gap they had identified in the existing framework of nurse workplace protections, specifically around the intersection of law enforcement interactions and triage authority in emergency settings. The gap existed in hospital policy documents across 17 states. It had existed for years. It was the reason an officer could walk into an ER and believe with some reasonable basis that a sufficiently forceful request could override a clinical decision. The director wanted to know if Lee would consult on a model policy framework. She sat with the question for 2 days. Not because she was uncertain of the answer, because she wanted to be clear about what she was agreeing to. Not a performance, not a public role, a specific piece of structural work that produced a document, that produced a standard, that protected the people who came after. She called back on the 3rd day. "I'll do it," she said, "but I want 2 people involved in the drafting." "Who?" "Sonia Hartwell," she said, "and a paramedic in Portland named Ruth Malone." The drafting process took 4 months, methodical, detailed, argued over and revised. Sonia pushed for teeth in the enforcement mechanism. Ruth pushed for language clear enough that a nurse on a night shift with no legal training could read it and know exactly what it said. Lee pushed for both. They met by video call on Tuesday evenings. Lee's choice of day, and she did not explain why, and they built something that had not existed before. The model policy was completed in June, distributed to hospital associations in 23 states, formally adopted by 7 of them within the first 3 months. The American College of Emergency Physicians issued a statement of support. 2 states introduced legislation based on the framework. The document had 3 authors. All of their names were on it. On a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after the day that had changed everything, Lee Calloway arrived at Riverside General Hospital at 6:40. She parked in the back lot, pulled her hair into a knot, clipped her badge, walked through the ambulance bay doors. The overnight crew was winding down, the morning shift coming in. The particular early stillness that preceded the day's volume. The protocol notices were on the walls. The new security protocols had been running for 10 months. The nursing staff had grown by 13 people since August. She poured coffee at the nurses' station, black, no sugar, and pulled up the board. 11 patients already waiting. 1 pediatric case flagged. She assessed it in 30 seconds. The pattern was familiar. The respiratory notation consistent with something that needed attention before the morning got louder. Priya was already there, a year more confident, with the specific quality of someone who had learned something true about herself and integrated it. "Morning," Priya said. "Morning." Lee looked at the board. "Pediatric flag, already paged respiratory?" "Reyes is on his way in," Priya said. Lee looked at her. "Good." She set down the coffee. She picked up the chart. She walked toward the bay where a child was waiting. Behind her, on the shelf above the nurse's station, placed there months ago without announcement, between the charging station and the hand sanitizer, visible but not prominent, was a small stuffed rabbit with a slightly bent ear. Its worn quality spoke of something that had been held in the dark many times. Priya had asked about it once, months ago. "It belongs to someone who went home," Lee had said. She hadn't explained further. She didn't need to. The floor was alive with its ordinary urgency. Monitors and voices, and the motion of people who had chosen, each for their own reasons, to spend their days in the place where the stakes were highest and the margin for error was smallest. Not because it was easy, not because it was appreciated, not because it protected them from the particular kind of harm that had been done in this very room a year ago, but because the work was real and the need was real, and some people were built in such a way that the realness of it was not a deterrent, but a reason. Lee pushed through the bay curtain. She introduced herself. She looked at the child. The mother looked up with the universal expression of a parent in a room they never wanted to be in. "Is she going to be okay?" the mother asked. Lee looked at the child, looked at the chart, looked back at the mother. "I'm going to find out exactly what's happening," she said, "and then we're going to fix it." It was not a guarantee. It was something better. It was true, and it was moving. And it was already in motion before the words finished leaving her mouth. Outside the bay, the floor ran on. The board filled. The morning escalated into its ordinary, extraordinary complexity. Somewhere in Columbus, a federal case was building toward trial. In Washington, a policy document was making its way through association reviews in 4 more states. In Dayton, a woman who had once left a career she loved was sitting with a choice that was finally fully hers to make. In Portland, a paramedic was running a call. In Milford, Ohio, in an emergency room that had learned something about itself a year ago and had not forgotten it, a nurse was doing exactly the thing she had always done. She was holding the line, not because someone was watching, not because the outcome was guaranteed, or the protection was certain, or the room would always recognize what it owed her, but because the line was the line, and she had never once in her life walked away from the place where she was needed most. Some people are built that way, and the world is better for every one of them who refuses to move.